The purpose of this lecture is to talk about some of the issues that you will run into when you are teaching, and how do we deal with some of these issues. First, what I want to talk about, and this is a book that sometimes I've used in class and haven't used in a while, but I would recommend that you check it out. It's a book by Chap Clark called Hurt. And the primary argument that he makes is that abandonment is the primary issue facing young people. And I actually think he's right. That as we think about the world of adolescence, what's happened is there's been this kind of fragmentation that's taken place. And so as identity formation is happening, it's become difficult for adolescents to really kind of firmly live into or construct an identity. They're being pulled in so many different ways. And some of the institutions and some of the narratives that used to be kind of foundational for the lives of young people are in trouble, or are fragmenting, or are right now are changing. Um, I think we're going through that right now in the world of education, for example, and what's happening in higher education and COVID and all of that is going to lead to something else on the other side. And that can bring anxiety for a lot of people. Like, what's the world going to look like, and how do we navigate it? And so what Clark does is he takes his research and he focuses on um, what he sees to be the issue of abandonment, that young people are being abandoned by the adult world. They're being abandoned to institutions that are more concerned about their own preservation, and adults are wanting young people to live up to their own expectations. And so young people are kind of understood to be more of a burden or an inconvenience, and then abandoned to these institutions. And so, and one of the things, if you look on the slide there, it talks about how these are systems that define and segregate, prioritize certain skills, certain types of people, certain behaviors, and then abandon others. And so these are educational systems, political systems, but even church institutions. And I think youth ministry can become one more place that, as much as we talk about creating community, we end up alienating certain segments of students who maybe don't want to play the game. And so I think it's important to begin by talking about Clark's arguments in Hurt. And so I'd recommend that you read it. And so he talks also about systems, lack of meaningful relationships with adults, um, and even for parents and teachers and youth ministers, kind of feeding off emotional gratification, that we want young people to kind of meet the expectations that we have or fit into our paradigm of the world, and Clark talks about how we even want to make a difference in the lives of young people, and so even that idea becomes this, like, well, they exist for me to do my thing. And then what the youth do is they actually end up creating their own communities, their own networks, and sometimes they actually copy the adult world in some of these systems, and create their own forms of abandonment and exclusion and so on. But I think it's important to recognize his argument here in how this institutional abandonment and even the abandonment of young people by the adult world works. And I think it's important to see, some people will say, well, wait a minute, adults are paying way more attention to young people than they ever did. But what kind of attention is being paid? And is it about meeting expectations? Would be Clark's question. And so as we think about the purpose of Christian education and youth ministry, then I think it's important for us to begin to talk about the space that we're trying to create. How do we create a space where young people can express doubts, wrestle with worldviews, try out ideas, bring their concerns and experience and passions? Again, what is the purpose? We've talked about this before. What are we trying to do? And for whom? Does the youth ministry exist so adults can feel better about themselves? Does it exist so that youth pastors can pat themselves on the back and have jobs? Or are we actually trying to create a space for young people where they can come and grow in their faith? Now, how then do we kind of shifting gears here a little bit, but how do we deal with some of the difficult behavior that can happen in trying to teach? And young people who maybe will come in and push boundaries and so on. I really appreciate the Simpsons pictures here with Bart at the center and the impact it can have. And the point of that is that type of behavior or difficult behavior can kind of ripple out. And so how do we deal with that without closing ourselves off to young people, without kind of contributing to this idea of abandonment? Well, the first thing I would say we need to do is recognize the difference between primary and secondary emotions. So when young people are lashing out, and if they're lashing out at you, or if they're not wanting to pay attention, or if they're not contributing, or look like they're bored and don't want to participate, sometimes, maybe oftentimes, those become symptoms of other issues going on in their life. And it's hard when you're the youth pastor or the teacher, because you don't know all of that stuff, and so you feel like it's offensive to you and disrespectful and so on and so forth. And yet I think when we recognize that the difference between primary and secondary emotions, and that oftentimes those secondary emotions are what are flaring up, and there's something deeper there, it can cause us or help us take a step back, not take it personally, and realize that, all right, there's some issues here we need to work through. It doesn't mean we let behavior go. It doesn't mean we don't address things, but it allows us to address things from a different perspective. Now, I really feel like one of the things that you need to do in teaching is think about that somatic, right? The utilization of space and proximity and separation. How do we organize the space in such a way that you can begin to help kind of deal with some behavior? Do you just let students sit wherever they want, where they group together and then they can, or do you put them in groups? Do you kind of dictate where everybody sits? And I understand that sometimes it's both, it's all of these things, but it's important to realize that kind of thinking about space and thinking about who's sitting next to who and all that kind of stuff really does matter, and can end up creating or changing the atmosphere of your teaching and of the youth ministry. Now, again, I understand we don't want to necessarily fall into the trap of making this into school, but there are ways of doing this, I think. And so as we think about proximity and separation, especially having adults kind of disperse through, sometimes having an adult sitting near, students who are kind of acting up and so on can be helpful. But trying to find ways of utilizing the space, and then even the way in which you organize the activities, can go a long way in trying to kind of cut off some of those behavioral problems before they even begin. I think it's very important to have eye contact, to let the students know that you are talking to them and that you see what's going on, that you see what's happening. There are some times where I've seen people who they just keep talking and they don't look at the people who are maybe misbehaving or whatever, or they don't look directly at people when they're talking. I know there's one teacher I used to work with who would always look up kind of at the ceiling, and I always would look back to say, what are they looking at? Having that eye contact is really important. Silence can be important. I know for me, I can get going and I can start talking and I can look out and I can see that students are just checked out and they're not listening. And the droning of my voice becomes this just hum that pushes them in a different direction where they check out. And then when I stop and I'm quiet for a minute, it brings everybody back. So recognizing the importance of how you speak and when to pause and when to be silent and when to stop. If a student is doing something, to just kind of stop a minute and look at them and draw their attention back to you. That's not always going to deal with the issue, but it can sometimes. I try to use humor. I think humor can be an important way of dealing with behavior. And but you got to be really, really careful with this. You don't want to make people feel bad. You're not trying to belittle them. You're not trying to berate them. But sometimes actually taking some of the things that they're doing and weaving it in, or trying to take it lightheartedly as a way of saying, like when I say to students, I know we're all tired, and I know my voice puts, I could do relaxation tapes. That's my way of saying, try to pay attention, or just kind of try to stay with me if you would, or try not to fall asleep. Um, or I'll sometimes will say to a student, are you meditating? And that's my way of saying, why don't you wake up? Now again, you got to be really careful with that. You got to know who you can do that with. But humor can sometimes be a way of trying to say something without actually having to come out and say it. Ultimately, then you do get to the place where you just have to ask the behavior to stop. And sometimes you have to do that in front of everybody and just say, hey, look, could you knock it off? You want to be nice about it, and respectful about it. But sometimes there's just stuff going on where you can't ignore it. And I think it's important to recognize that when you ignore something, it's going to continue, and it's probably going to get worse. So sometimes you may just need to say, all right, please stop doing this. Now, preferably you'll be able to do that in a private conversation. Pull them aside, talk to them afterward, have that conversation and say, look, we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute, but please, stop doing this. And then obviously if things get really terrible and things aren't happening, that you may need to take it up a notch to getting other people involved, whether it's parents or other adults, just having that conversation. But the important point, and this is why I wanted to start with the abandonment stuff, is however we deal with the difficult issues, we need to do so in a way that signals a couple of different things. We want you here. We love you, and we want you to be here. But this type of behavior just can't keep happening. Holding those two things in tension, I think, are important. I think kicking kids out and all that kind of stuff is problematic. I mean, unless it is just so terrible that it's destroying the youth ministry, we want to avoid that. We want to make sure students feel as though they're wanted and that they can be present. And at the same time, as we go back to kind of the Andy Root stuff, it's important to recognize the boundaries and humanizing others and so on. So those are just a few tips on how to kind of deal with this behavior, and you kind of figure it out. I mean, this is stuff that you have to learn by doing, and so you'll find a method and you'll find a way. But I think it's important to recognize that you do want to deal with this stuff right up front. Sometimes you got to have those hard conversations with students, and you have them in private, obviously, but it's important to have them. And so don't be afraid of them, and don't take things personally. And so as the youth pastor, your job is to do this, to have these conversations. And so you'll bring students in and you'll just say, hey, how are things going? When I have issues with students, or I'm trying to deal with stuff in class or whatever, a lot of times I bring them into my office. I say, hey, how's it going? How are things, how's your year going? But then you want to get more specific. How are things at home? How's school? And all of that is a way to provide a basis for a student to maybe talk about some things that are going on that, again, might be the primary issue of why they're acting up. But then you might want to get into, all right, look, how do you like youth group? How's Sunday school going? How do you see things going? And you ask it that way to really give them the opportunity to speak. It's not as though you want to be so overly democratic that they might say, oh, I think this sucks, or you got to do this and this, and you're just going to do whatever they say. What this is doing is inviting them to kind of share with you what they see as the problem, so you can actually begin to address some things. And then if you need to address behavior, a lot of times I think it's important to focus on the action and the behavior. and really focus on your own experience of it. So to say, look, hey, I notice when we do this, you do this, or I notice you're not paying attention, or I notice you're um, disrupting or sleeping or whatever. And I think it's important to talk about um, your perceptions of this. So to say, when this happens, this is how I feel about it. Um, or, when you do this, this is how I feel about it. Or you can talk about, hey, this is how it affects the group, and really focus on the behavior. And I think coming back to say, hey, we really want you here, we care about you, and really emphasizing that and making sure that you're not attacking their person, but really focused on the behaviors of, all right, this is what I see happening. This is how I feel about it when this happens. And, this is how it's kind of affecting things. I think it's important to focus on those things. These are hard conversations, but I think they're important, and I think you'll get better at them as you do them. Don't be afraid of them, and do them in such a way where you can all walk away and hopefully have some reconciliation, feel better about what's going on. Um, and again, it will be better for the student, it'll be better for you, and be better for the youth ministry. Some important points. Don't let things go. The more you let them go, the more they're going to build up and the worse they're going to get. Always address the behavior, not the person. We just talked about that. I really believe respect is earned, and you're going to earn the respect of the students. I mean, going around, I've known people going around saying, I'm the teacher, you must respect me, or I'm this, you must respect me. It doesn't work. Should there be respect for a particular office or a particular, yeah, sure. But the reality is that we all earn the respect of others. And so it's important for you to keep that in mind. Suffering with the adolescent includes suffering from the adolescent, and that's from root. That when you're entering into their lives means sometimes they're going to disappoint, sometimes they're going to be disruptive, sometimes they're going to do things you don't appreciate. And that's just part of the gig. It's part of the job. And I think when we know that, it allows us to kind of move forward. And then discipline always needs to be done in love. And by discipline, I simply mean addressing these things, establishing that yes and no, the boundaries and humanization, saying, look, this needs to stop, and being firm about that, but doing so in love and saying, we love you, we want you here, but this is kind of got to stop. Anytime you have to address some of these issues, I think it's important for you to take that approach. So there are some other issues that we can also talk about, like how do you deal with parents and things like that, and we'll talk about that down the road. But I wanted to get some of these points out here as we talk about how do you deal with difficult students, how do you deal with disruption during your teaching, and then kind of in the future we'll talk about some of those other issues.